Let us begin not with an answer, but with a question that sounds almost offensive on first hearing. Is it really true that you always get what you want? Most people immediately object. They say, that can't be right. I wanted success and failed. I wanted love and was abandoned. I wanted peace and found anxiety. I wanted clarity and ended up confused. And yet, if you listen carefully, if you stay with the question without rushing to defend yourself, something curious begins to unfold. Because the statement does not mean what it seems to mean. It is not a promise from the universe, nor a motivational slogan, nor a cosmic vending machine that hands you prizes for good behavior. It is a mirror, and mirrors are unsettling because they show you what is actually there, not what you hope to see. We are accustomed to thinking of wanting as a simple thing. I want this job, this relationship, this recognition, this feeling. And when we do not get it, we assume life has refused us. But wanting is not simple at all. Wanting is layered. On the surface is what you say you want, what you tell your friends, what you post in your affirmations and your plans. Beneath that is what you emotionally expect. And deeper still is what you unconsciously insist upon, cling to and rehearse in the theater of your inner world. Life, in its peculiar way, does not respond to slogans. It responds to patterns. And the pattern you live is the pattern you receive. Consider for a moment how often people claim they want peace, yet organize their entire lives around tension. They thrive on conflict, define themselves through struggle, and feel strangely empty when things are calm. Or how many say they want love, yet are deeply invested in being rejected, misunderstood, or superiorly self-sufficient? They move through relationships with an invisible script that says, see, this is how it always ends. And it does. Not because fate is cruel, but because the pattern is faithful. What you get is not what you want in theory, it is what you want in practice. Now this is where discomfort enters, because it sounds as though one is blaming the individual for every sorrow. That is not the point. The point is not guilt, it is awareness. To notice that the sense of being a victim of life's refusals is itself a position one may be very attached to. There is a certain identity in being the one who was denied, overlooked, unlucky, or wronged. It gives shape to the story of me. And stories are addictive. We will sacrifice enormous possibilities just to remain consistent with the narrative we have been telling ourselves. The strange thing about the human mind is that it would rather be certain than free. Even if the certainty is painful, it is familiar, and familiarity feels safe, so we unconsciously arrange our circumstances to confirm what we already believe. This is not done deliberately. No one wakes up and says, today I will sabotage my happiness. It is done subtly, through habits of attention, through the tone of our expectations, through the questions we keep asking ourselves again and again. If you expect rejection, you will notice rejection everywhere. If you expect failure, you will interpret neutral events as evidence of failure. If you expect chaos, you will be exquisitely sensitive to disorder and blind to harmony. And then you will say, see, this is what always happens to me. In this sense, life is not so much happening to you as it is happening with you. It is a dance, not a collision. When people hear the phrase, you always get what you want, they imagine a crude system of reward and punishment. But the wisdom hidden here is far more subtle. It points to the way desire itself is structured. Desire is not just wanting something to happen. Desire is wanting to continue being the kind of person who wants that thing. And often the wanting is more important to the ego than the fulfillment. Think of how many ambitions lose their glow once achieved. The longed-for position becomes routine. The dream house becomes a maintenance problem. The admired status becomes a burden of expectation. The thrill was not in having, but in wanting. The chase gave life a sense of direction, a sense of meaning. And so, when the object is reached, the mind quickly invents a new lack. Not because it is ungrateful, but because it needs the tension of desire to feel alive. This reveals something startling. we do not actually want satisfaction. We want the movement toward satisfaction. We want the story of becoming, not the stillness of being. And so life generously supplies us with endless reasons to keep wanting. From this perspective, you always get exactly what you want, an excuse to continue. Now, there is another layer to this insight, and it concerns control. We are trained to believe that life is something to be managed, dominated, engineered into submission. We set goals as if the universe were a reluctant employee that must be coerced into productivity. When things go wrong, we interpret it as resistance, failure, or injustice. But what if the universe is not resisting you at all? What if it is cooperating with you so completely that it even supports your confusion? If you are deeply convinced that life is a struggle, life will present itself as a struggle. If you are convinced that joy must be earned through suffering, joy will arrive only after suffering. If you believe that peace is rare and fragile, peace will feel temporary and easily disturbed. Not because these beliefs are true in any absolute sense, but because they are the lenses through which you experience everything. And here is the paradox. The more desperately you try to control life to get what you think you want, the more you ensure that you do not get it, because control is based on mistrust. It says, I do not believe life knows what it is doing, so I must intervene. And life responds not with punishment, but with complexity. The more you tighten your grip, the more tangled things become. It is like trying to smooth water with your hands. The harder you press, the more ripples you create. And then you complain that the water refuses to be calm, but water is calm by nature. It is your interference that disturbs it. Now, notice how this applies inwardly as well. When you try to force yourself to be confident, you become self-conscious. When you try to force yourself to be calm, you become tense. When you try to force yourself to be happy, you become acutely aware of your unhappiness. The effort itself creates the problem. And why? We persist, because we are convinced that effort is the answer to everything. So when someone says, you always get what you want, they are pointing not to the surface level desires, but to the deeper orientation of your being. Are you oriented toward trust or suspicion, toward openness or defense, toward curiosity or certainty? Life reflects that orientation back to you with astonishing precision. This does not mean that pain disappears when you become aware of it. Pain is part of the human experience. Loss happens. Bodies age. People leave. Dreams change shape. Here is not about avoiding pain, but about noticing how much extra suffering we create by arguing with reality. We suffer not only because things happen, but because we insist they should not have happened. And that insistence is a desire for the past to be different, for life to conform to an imagined script. And does life grant that desire? In a way, yes. It grants you endless opportunities to relive your resistance, to replay the grievance, to retell the story, to refine the argument. You get exactly what you want, the continuation of the conflict. Now imagine just for a moment what would happen if you stopped demanding that life justify itself to you. Not in resignation, not in apathy, but in curiosity. What if you approached experience the way you approach music? Not asking where it is going, but listening to how it moves. Music has tension and release, discord and harmony, surprise and repetition. If it were all harmony, it would be boring. If it were all tension, it would be unbearable. Meaning arises from the whole. Your life is not a problem to be solved. It is an experience to be lived. And when you treat it as a problem, you will always feel behind, inadequate, unfinished. When you treat it as an experience, even confusion becomes interesting. Even uncertainty has flavor. This is where the deepest freedom lies, not in getting what you think you want, but in seeing through the illusion that your happiness depends on controlling outcomes. When that illusion loosens, something extraordinary happens. You discover that what you have been seeking has been present all along. disguised as the ordinary. You see, the self that is always striving to get something is a kind of phantom. It is a mental image, a bundle of expectations and fears, trying to secure its own continuity. It wants to be important, successful, recognized, safe. And life keeps frustrating it, not out of cruelty, but because it is not real in the way it thinks it is. The more you chase satisfaction for this phantom, the more elusive it becomes. But when you stop chasing, when you allow experience to unfold without constantly measuring it against your demands, you begin to sense something else, something that is not trying to get anywhere, something that is simply here, breathing, hearing, seeing, feeling. This presence does not need to be improved, does not need to be justified. It does not need to be completed. And here is the quiet revelation. This presence is what you have always wanted. Not the objects, not the achievements, not the approval. Those were symbols. They were metaphors for a sense of wholeness, of being at ease with existence. And because you misunderstood the symbol for the thing itself, you kept chasing the symbol. Life, ever patient, kept giving you more chances to notice the mistake. So when it is said that you always get what you want, it is not a condemnation. It is an invitation to look more honestly at what you are asking for. Are you asking for life, or are you asking for a particular image of life? Are you asking for freedom, or are you asking for security? Are you asking for aliveness, or are you asking for guarantees? Life cannot give you guarantees, because guarantees are about the future and life is always now. But it can give you reality, which is far more interesting if you let it. The moment you stop insisting that the present moment be a means to some future satisfaction, it reveals itself as complete. Not perfect, not painless, but complete. And in that completeness, the frantic wanting relaxes. Desire does not disappear, but it becomes playful rather than desperate. You can want without needing. You can prefer without clinging. You can act without being obsessed with results. And paradoxically, when you no longer demand that life give you what you want, it often gives you more than you imagined. Not because you have unlocked a secret technique, but because you are finally aligned with the way things are. You are no longer fighting the current, you are swimming with it. So perhaps the truest meaning of this idea is not that you always get what you want, but that life always reveals what you truly want. And if you are brave enough to see that clearly, you may find that what you wanted was not control, not certainty, not constant pleasure, but participation. To be part of the movement, to belong to the dance. And when you see that, you might laugh. Not because everything suddenly makes sense, but because you realize you were never excluded. You were never denied. You were never waiting at the door of life, hoping to be let in. You were always already inside, pretending to be locked out, because the game of wanting was so absorbing. And if you stay with that laughter a little longer, you may notice that it is not the laughter of mockery or triumph, but the laughter that arises when attention quietly releases. It is the laughter that comes when you see how seriously you have been taking a game that was never meant to be solved. Because the strange truth is that the universe is not asking you to get anywhere in particular. It is not waiting for you to finally figure it out so that it can reward you with peace. It has already given you the raw materials of peace, but you have been too busy rearranging them into familiar patterns of dissatisfaction. Notice how the mind is always leaning. G forward. It is rarely where the body is. The body is sitting, breathing, listening, aging, healing, responding. The mind, meanwhile, is rehearsing tomorrow, correcting yesterday, and evaluating whether this moment is good enough to justify its existence. And then we wonder why life feels thin, why it feels as though something is missing. What is missing is not an object, but attention. The mind is elsewhere, and then it complains that here is unsatisfying. When you say you want meaning, what you often mean is that you want a reason to tolerate the present. You want a justification for now in terms of later. But meaning does not come from justification. It comes from intimacy. It comes from being so close to experience that you are no longer standing apart from it, judging whether it meets your standards. And that closeness cannot be forced. It arrives when the habit of resistance softens. Think of how often you say, "Once I understand myself, then I'll be free." But this assumes that the self is an object you can pin down, analyze, and finally master. In practice, the more you analyze yourself, the more layers you find. Each answer produces new questions. Each insight reveals new contradictions. And this is not a failure of introspection, it is a clue. It suggests that the self you are trying to understand is not a thing at all, but a process. Trying to grasp it is like trying to catch a river with your hands. Yet we persist, because we imagine that once we finally know who we are, we can decide how to live. But living is what you are already doing. You cannot step outside the process to plan it from a neutral position. Even your confusion is part of the flow. Even your resistance is part of the movement. And life does not wait for you to resolve your inner debates before it continues. It continues anyway, patiently including your hesitation as one of its gestures. This is why the idea that you always get what you want can be so revealing. It exposes how often we want to delay life until certain conditions are met, until we are more confident, until we are more prepared, until we are less afraid. And life obligingly gives us endless opportunities to practice delay. It gives us reasons to wait, reasons to doubt, reasons to hold back, because waiting is what we are actually invested in. We say we want change, but we are deeply attached to the identity that change would threaten. We say we want truth, but only if it does not disturb the conclusions we have already drawn. We say we want freedom, but we cling to the rules that define us, because without them, we would not know who we are supposed to be. And so life gives us what we want: continuity, familiarity, the comfort of the known, even when the known hurts. If you watch carefully, you will see how often suffering is maintained not by circumstances, but by loyalty. Loyalty to an image of oneself as a certain kind of person with a certain kind of story. Letting go of that story can feel like betrayal. Who would you be without your grievances, your ambitions, your regrets? Who would you be if you did not constantly remind yourself of what went wrong or what must still be achieved? The fear is not that life would become meaningless, but that it would become open. And openness is frightening to a mind that wants guarantees. An open moment does not tell you who you are. It does not confirm your importance. It does not promise that everything will work out according to plan. It simply invites you to participate. And participation is risky. It means you might feel things you did not plan to feel. It means you might respond rather than react. It means you might discover that you are not as separate from the world as you thought. The boundaries soften. The sharp edges of me versus life blur. And for the ego, that feels like danger. So it tightens its grip. It insists on control. It doubles down on effort. It says, "I must get what I want or else." And life, with impeccable irony, responds by showing how exhausting that stance is. It gives you more to manage, more to fix, more to worry about. Not to punish you, but to make the lesson unmistakable. Eventually, if you are listening, fatigue sets in. Not the fatigue of the body, but the fatigue of the struggle. The sense that you cannot keep pushing reality into a shape it does not want to hold. And in that exhaustion, something softens. Not because you have won, but because you have stopped fighting. And suddenly, without fanfare, the moment is allowed to be what it is. This allowance is not passive. It is not giving up on life. It is giving up on the fantasy that life should conform to your internal commentary. And when that fantasy loosens, you begin to notice details that were always there. The texture of sound, the rhythm of breath, the simple fact of being conscious at all. These are not solutions to problems, but they are real. And reality has a grounding effect that no theory can provide. From this place, wanting changes its character. It becomes lighter, less desperate. You may still prefer certain outcomes. You may still work, plan, and choose. You are no longer staking your existence on the results. Failure does not annihilate you. Success does not complete you. They become events rather than verdicts. And this is perhaps the most radical shift of all, to see that life is not judging you. The sense of being judged comes from within, from the internal voice that keeps score. When that voice quiets, even briefly, the world feels surprisingly neutral, not cold, but spacious, not indifferent, but unburdened by your self-importance. In that spaciousness, the old question, why didn't I get what I wanted, loses its urgency, because you begin to see that what arrived instead was not a mistake. It was simply different from the fantasy. And fantasies, by their nature, cannot be lived in. They can only be chased. Life gives you what it can actually give: experience, sense, sensation, change, relationship, uncertainty. And if you stop insisting that experience be something other than what it is, you may find that it is enough, not forever, not in some permanent state of bliss, but enough for now. And now, it turns out, is the only place where anything ever happens. From here, the idea that you always get what you want no longer sounds accusatory. It sounds descriptive. It describes how faithfully life mirrors your orientation toward it. When you approach it as an enemy, it behaves like one. When you approach it as a puzzle, it becomes complicated. When you approach it as a dance, it moves with you. And the dance does not end. It does not resolve into a final pose. It keeps changing tempo, changing partners, changing rhythms. The mistake is to think that there is a point at which the music stops and you are finally allowed to rest. Rest happens within the movement, not after it. Peace is not the absence of change, but comfort with change. If you listen closely, you may hear that this has been whispered to you all along. In moments when striving fell away and something simple felt complete. In moments of absorption when you forgot yourself and time slipped by unnoticed. In moments of grief when resistance softened and love was felt more nakedly than ever. These moments were not rewards for getting what you wanted. They were glimpses of what remains when wanting loosens its grip. And life, endlessly creative, keeps offering these glimpses, not as answers, but as invitations. Not to conclude anything, but to continue, more lightly, more honestly, more awake. And as that lightness begins to be felt, you may notice something curious about choice itself. We like to imagine that we stand apart from life, selecting from a menu of possibilities, steering events according to our will. But if you look closely, you will see that choices arise the way thoughts arise, spontaneously from conditions you did not personally arrange. A preference appears, an impulse moves, a decision happens. Only afterward does the mind rush in to claim ownership and say, I chose this. And yet the choosing was already in motion before the story was told. This is not meant to deny responsibility, but to soften the illusion of absolute authorship. When you realize that you are not the isolated origin of your actions, a great burden lifts. You no longer have to prove that you are in control of life. You can respond intelligently without pretending to be omnipotent. And in that response, there is a kind of grace, an ease that comes from cooperating rather than commanding. Notice how much of your anxiety is tied to the idea that things should be different because you could have made a better choice. The mind replays the past endlessly, editing scenes, rewriting dialogue, imagining alternate outcomes. But this replay is itself a desire to maintain the illusion that life could have been mastered if only you had done something else. And life grants that desire by giving you endless mental reruns. You get what you want, the chance to stay entangled in regret. What would happen if you saw the past not as a series of mistakes, but as the only way things could have unfolded given the conditions at the time? Not as fate in a rigid sense, but as inevitability in a fluid one. Each moment arising from the whole of the previous moment, like a wave shaped by the entire ocean. This view does not make you passive. It makes you realistic. It allows you to learn without self-flagellation, to adjust without condemnation. From this perspective, even confusion has its place. Confusion is what happens when old maps no longer match the territory, and instead of seeing confusion as a failure, you might see it as a sign of growth. Life has become too rich, too complex, to fit into your previous understanding, and so it loosens your grip on certainty. It takes away the answers you leaned on. It gives you what you want at a deeper level, the chance to see freshly. Fresh seeing is rare because it requires not knowing. And not knowing is uncomfortable for a mind that equates certainty with safety. So we rush to conclusions. We adopt beliefs, ideologies, identities. We say, this is who I am, this is how the world works, this is what is possible for me. And life, ever cooperative, arranges itself to confirm those declarations, not because they are true, but because we act as though they are. This is why two people can live in the same world and inhabit entirely different realities. One sees opportunity where the other sees threat. One experiences change as adventure, the other as disaster. The difference is not in the events, but in the wanting. One wants to stay open, the other wants to stay protected. And life honors both orientations. Protection, however, has a cost. To protect yourself from pain, you must also protect yourself from joy, because both come from the same openness. To protect yourself from uncertainty, you must limit your curiosity, because curiosity dissolves fixed positions. And so the protected life often feels small, repetitive, constrained, not because life is limited, but because the wanting is. When people say they feel stuck, they often mean that life has stopped responding to their efforts. But life has not stopped. It has simply stabilized around their expectations. It has given them exactly what they have been asking for, predictability. And predictability, when mistaken for security, eventually feels like imprisonment. Freedom does not come from getting rid of limitations. It comes from seeing how you participate in creating them. And that seeing is itself liberating. Because the moment you notice the pattern, you are no longer completely inside it. You can play with it. You can loosen it. You can let it be there without being defined by it. This playfulness is essential. Without it, insight becomes another burden, another standard to live up to. You begin to say, I should be more present. I should be less attached. I should understand this by now. And the word should is a subtle form of violence. It is the voice of an imagined authority, telling life how it must unfold. And life responds by resisting, by slipping away, by refusing to conform. But when you approach your own patterns with humor, with curiosity rather than condemnation, something shifts. You see yourself wanting what you want, and instead of immediately trying to change it, you watch it. You notice how desire arises, peaks, fades, transforms. You see how it pulls your attention into the future or the past. And in that watching, desire loses some of its compulsive power. This does not mean you become indifferent. It means you become intimate. You are no longer at war with your own impulses. You are learning their language. And they begin to reveal what they have always been pointing toward. Not the object they fixate on, but the energy behind them, the aliveness, the longing to move, to connect, to express. When that energy is no longer narrowly focused on specific outcomes, it spreads. It animates your actions without enslaving you to results. You can work intensely without being crushed by failure. You can care deeply without being destroyed by loss, because your sense of self is no longer entirely invested in what happens. And then something subtle occurs. The question, what do I want, begins to feel less important than what is happening now. Attention shifts from project to participation. You are no longer trying to extract meaning from life. You are discovering it in the act of living. Not as a conclusion, but as an ongoing conversation. Life, after all, is not a statement. It is a question. And it is a question that keeps changing as you engage with it. The trouble begins when you try to answer it once and for all, when you decide what life is supposed to mean, and then demand that it behave accordingly. That demand is a form of wanting, and life responds by giving you endless arguments against your conclusion. But when you allow the question to remain open, something relaxes. You no longer need life to make sense in a final way. You only need to listen, and listening is a form of trust. It says, I am willing to be surprised. And life, delighted by this willingness, becomes endlessly surprising. This is not mystical, it is practical. When you are not obsessed with defending an image of how things should be, you respond more intelligently to how they are. You notice possibilities that were previously invisible because they did not fit your plan. You adapt, you improvise, you discover capacities you did not know you had. From the outside, it may look as though you are finally getting what you want, but from the inside, it feels very different. It feels as though the urgency to want has softened. You are less concerned with extracting guarantees from the future. You are more interested in the texture of the present, and that interest has its own quiet satisfaction. Life continues to offer pleasure and pain, gain and loss, clarity and confusion, but they no longer define you in the same way. They pass through rather than stick. You are learning not how to avoid the waves, but how to float. And floating, strangely enough, requires less effort than struggling to stay upright. In this floating, the idea of deserving or not deserving what happens loses its grip. Events are no longer interpreted as personal verdicts. They are seen as movements in a larger process that you are part of, but not in charge of. This releases a tremendous amount of energy that was previously tied up in self-judgment. That energy does not disappear. It becomes available for creativity, for attention, for care. You begin to act not because you are trying to secure your worth, but because action itself is an expression of being alive. And in that expression, there is a kind of quiet joy, not the excitement of achievement, but the steadiness of participation. And so life keeps unfolding, not toward a final resolution, but into ever-changing forms of experience, each one complete in its own way, each one asking only that you meet it as it arrives, without demanding that it justify itself in advance. So in the end, the phrase, "you always get what you want," is not a verdict passed down by the universe, nor a promise carved into the structure of reality. It is a lens through which to see how intimately involved you are in the shape of your own experience. It reveals that life is not something happening at a distance, but something happening in participation with your deepest assumptions, expectations, and attachments. What appears as fate is often habit. What feels like denial is often confirmation. And what seems like chance is frequently a reflection. When this is seen clearly, there is no need for self-blame and no need for self-congratulation. Both are ways of keeping the story of me versus life intact. Instead, there is a quiet recognition that you have been in conversation with existence all along, and that conversation has been astonishingly honest. Life has not misunderstood you. It has listened carefully, responding not to your words, but to your orientation, to the way you meet each moment. And in that recognition, a different kind of freedom appears. Not the freedom to guarantee outcomes, but the freedom to stop bargaining with reality. The freedom to want without being possessed by wanting. The freedom to act without demanding that action secure your identity. You discover that peace was never hidden behind the next achievement or the next answer, but was waiting in the relaxation of your resistance. From this place, living becomes simpler, though not easier. You still feel, you still choose, you still care. But you no longer demand that life conform to a mental blueprint before you allow yourself to be present. You meet experience as it is, trusting that participation itself is enough, and perhaps that is the deepest fulfillment there is. Not getting everything you thought you wanted, but realizing that what you truly wanted was to be fully here, fully alive, and no longer at war with the moment unfolding before you.